Hello and welcome to Metra Home Theater Tech Tips. I'm Brent.
I'm Adam.
And
I'm Dave from CEDIA.
and he's Dave.
Hey,
now, Dave is actually Dave Meyer.
Yep.
Does a lot of the training and research for CEDIA, specifically in HDMI and HDR. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. All things technology, in fact, but video is certainly a specialty of mine.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, Dave has been a huge resource to both Adam and I for the past 4 weeks as we've gone over our HDR broadcast, and some of the things that we got wrong, he has helped us clear up.
Yes.
And it really got us excited to include him into a show to cover a lot more than Adam and I could. Now, I'll be right up front, Adam has done a lot more research down this road.
Yep.
Than I have. My goal has just been making it work. Adam's been trying to understand why it's not working.
Well, and even more so, of course, we've got Dave here, who is even well beyond myself. So we're going to be pulling a lot of information from you, Dave, to kind of get a better idea for it. Now, of course, I don't think an hour's worth of time for what we would normally do for an episode, it would be enough time to really go over everything that has to do with HDR.
Or much.
Or honestly, yeah, very much at all. So in fact, what we've done today is we're just going to talk about the misconceptions of HDR. Now, as you'll notice, today is a little bit different. We're not live today. This is a pre-recorded episode. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about today, make sure you put them down in the comment section below. Myself and Brent, we will be probably monitoring the comments as this video goes live. And if any good questions, good comments come up, of course, we'll make sure that Dave, of course, is kept in the loop with all of that as well. So
now, it is important to know he is in the other side of the world, literally.
Yep.
So he's in a different time zone from us, so I doubt he'll be on the live to answer questions, but get them out to us and we'll make sure that he answers them. Now, before we get deep into this, honestly, I would like to know a little bit more about you, Dave, what you do and how you do it for CEDIA.
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks, guys, for inviting me along. This is going to be fun.
Thanks for coming.
So my background is long and sordid. I've been in the industry for about 25 years, thereabouts. It's been a big, long learning curve, continues to be a learning curve, and very much a specialty in video. HDMI is a big part of my history. Started in the industry on the tools in retail, moved on to wholesale manufacturing, was actually a signatory to the HDMI adopter agreement back in 2005. So that was pretty early days for HDMI, and have just moved through from there and gained more and more of an interest in video in particular, because that's the lion's share of bandwidth in HDMI. And just how those two interrelate. So HDR is just a natural progression from that. But I've been working now full-time for CEDIA for 4 years. So various capacities, education department, technology and standards, doing research, writing, presenting courses, mostly about connectivity and video. So I'm sure many people in the industry will have seen me at various expos and ISE and various events around the world, actually. So lots of fun.
Fantastic. And again, thank you for joining us. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Adam because I know he is full of questions.
So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just kind of jump right in. One of the biggest things when it comes to HDR is the fact that it is just so incredibly, I mean, honestly, when you finally begin to crack into it and begin to understand what it is, there's a lot of math involved. There's a lot of things going on with it. And one of the biggest misconceptions that I've seen about HDR is primarily what the different standards mean. So of course we've got HDR, everyone says HDR, and then we've got HDR 10, and then there was like an HDR like 400 at one point, and then there's like an HDR, now there's HDR 10 Plus and Dolby Vision, and
then manufacturers have their own names just to make it a little bit more confusing.
Exactly.
HDR 1000, I think, was LG at one point.
Yeah. And so really what that comes down to, Dave, is what kind of standards are we working with today, and do we call them standards for that matter?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it can be confusing. It's funny that you mentioned HDR 400 there, because I don't come across that one much, but it's out there, and there's a whole family. So just to cover that one off right away, that's more a certification for products from Visa. It's not actually a standard for HDR in terms of media and delivery. It's really just about certifying a display to say, yeah, this one can do 400 nits, this one can do 1,000 nits. So that's not actually necessarily an HDR standard as such. The standards themselves, and yes, there is a number of standards, and there's subsets within those standards as well.
So standards, substandards, and lack of standards.
Yeah, I know. One of my favourite quotes is, the best thing about standards is we have so many to choose from. But it can get confusing. So if there was one HDR standard, it's like, is it HDR or not? That would make it really easy. But hey, that'd just be way too easy, wouldn't it?
Of course.
Communist.
So we've got... Yeah, so what happened was... way back when, just telling a brief bit about the history of where HDR came from, it actually all started with a company called Brightside Technologies out of Canada, and they developed the concept for this system of HDR based on a paper from 1999 that came out of Amsterdam. And so Brightside then developed this high dynamic range, and let's be clear, high dynamic range, another misconception. I'm probably going to, I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of you here, Adam, but one misconception about HDR is it just means lots of brightness.
Right.
But not necessarily. It's also about lots of darkness as well. It's dynamic range. So we're going just as much down into dark as we are up into bright compared to traditional TV. So anyway, what happened with Brightside is it eventuated into Dolby Vision, which we know.
Right.
SMPTE, Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. That's the organisation that defines the standards for basically how to make movies look and sound, and television as well, so that everything interoperates fine. And they got on board and said, this is awesome, we want a piece of this. And they basically set it in stone with a standard called SMPTE ST 2084. And it's from there, the CTA then said, it's Consumer Technology Association, that's the mob that puts on CES each year. They said, this is great, we want this for consumers, and they ratified it with a few boundaries and called it HDR 10. And from there, it's just grown. So Dolby continued on their path with Dolby Vision. CTA defined HDR 10, and then others came along and said, we can make HDR 10 even better, and it became 10 plus. And then there's other competing formats, one of which is called HLG, which is really just for broadcast TV.
Right.
And then there's Technicolor that also come up with their own variations of it, which we're not unfortunately seeing much of out there, but hey, we're still getting enough with the others. So that's pretty much the range of standards that we're working with right now.
So when we're talking about HLG and the fact that it's being used inside of broadcast television, well, not to divert too far across over into that one, but with HLG, one of the things that I came across, and this was just a really small comment that someone had put on one of the forums, or a question that they had put out, was, if you have an HLG signal, does that mean that the old SDR displays that I have, or even back into the tube TVs, because some people here they still run things off of antennas and use tube TVs and whatnot, are they going to be able to see the same thing? And luckily in my research I found that no, it doesn't matter. It'll all work together, and how that works, is that correct?
Yeah. The thing with most HDR formats is that they do require post-production. With live broadcasts, there is no time for post-production. You just want to get it out there, and the delay is perhaps a few seconds at most. And the last thing the broadcasters want is to have two cameras set up at each location. We're talking courtside, field side, whatever the sport may be. That they don't want one for SDR, one for HDR, and have two concurrent broadcasts. They want one camera, one broadcast, and if it's going to an HDR TV, to have it optimized. If it's going to an SDR TV, that it be backwards compatible. And that's exactly what HLG is designed to do.
Very nice.
So we've got one broadcast. It doesn't require any metadata, because that's something that well, I mean, it can happen on the fly, but it actually just inherently doesn't need it. So HLG, it won't give you as good a result overall necessarily as what you'll get from the likes of Dolby Vision or HDR10 Plus, but it'll give you a great looking image, but have that adaptability to any type of display.
Very nice. So when we, and to go back to what you were talking about before about one of the misconceptions being that HDR means that I'm just going to have a super bright display. This is one thing that you helped me to learn as well, is that it's not so much that you're going to have, HDR doesn't mean that you're going to be blown away because it's so bright. It's like looking in one of these, set lamps that we have here. It's not like that. It's more that you have, it's in the name. It's that dynamic range. And so going into talking about that some more, kind of fill us in talking about the human eye was one of the big things that I was really interested in when I was doing the research on it, about how we see more of the darker side of things. Is that right?
Yeah. This is going back to that paper that I mentioned before, from 1999. Peter Barton, working out of the University of Eindhoven in Amsterdam, and did a study to figure out just what the dynamic range capability of our eye is. But keep in mind that our eye can dilate or constrict. If it's bright, our eyes constrict right down to pinpoints in brightness, go into a dark room, and they'll dilate to get in as much light in as possible, very much like the iris in a camera lens. So there's two things we need to consider. One is our absolute range, from what's the brightest we can see with our eyes fully constricted, and what's the darkest we can see with our eyes fully dilated, because our eyes are still going to naturally do that even when we're watching a movie.
Right.
And just as we are in real life. And then there's in what I just refer to as in-scene dynamic range, which is at any given level of dilation. What's the dynamic range that our eyes can see? And the goal of HDR is to make sure that the video system can at least match what our eyes are capable of seeing. But our eyes are actually more sensitive to changes in dark than they are to changes in bright. And this is where the whole stops of light comes in, is that if one stop of light is a doubling or a halving depending on which direction you're going. So every time we halve the amount of light, we're getting darker and darker. But we're halving the size of the steps each time too. So by the time at the bottom end, we're talking tiny, tiny little steps, and we can actually see the changes. But you go from 2,000 to 3,000 nits, and you will see a difference there. But you go from 2,000 to 2,100, you're probably not going to see much difference. Even though from 0 to 100, you're going to see every bit of difference. A
lot of difference in that, yeah. Yeah, so there's just a greater amount of difference that we can see on the darker side. So now,
much like audio, you don't get to get 3 dB of audio, you have to double the power.
Right.
To double the volume, you have to multiply the power by 10.
Right.
So it's the same thing. If you've got 5 watts, all you got to do is go to 10.
Right.
But if you're at 100 watts, you got to go to 200 to hear an audible difference.
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
Generally speaking, yeah. So now with something like that, actually, and to move on to the next misconception that even we had on one of these things, this is actually one of the ones that
I got called out on.
That you got called out on. So Brent, what was the main thing on that?
Well, I said you can have HDR without deep color.
And the 8-bit, without deep color. Yeah,
basically
exactly.
Without deep color, because at 8-bit.
Yeah.
Because of the brightness changes, but I suppose technically I was right, but that is a very thin slicing of the details for me to claim any level of righteousness on that one.
Super thin on that. So the reality is, of course, and Dave, if you'll fill us in a little bit more on it, the misconception is that you can have HDR on any range of the color gamut or the color depth, pardon me, for that. But the truth of the matter is, and if you can take it from there, actually, to fill us in.
Yeah, the long-term goal of HDR is to offer a dynamic range or a brightness range starting at 0.0005 candela per square meter or nits, which is black. That's like black.
OLED.
Yeah.
Right up to 10,000 nits. And then that's a range of approximately 24 stops. SDR is 0.5 to 100 nits. So SDR is just the term that we've since kind of bolted on to talk about legacy TV. It's a term that didn't exist previous.
Right.
A little bit like a series of movies. The first movie never comes out with a 1 behind the title. It's always just whatever it is. And then we start with the 2 counting on. So it's a retrospective thing. But HDR goes about approximately 6.5 stops down from the old SDR range down into the blacks, and approximately 6.5 stops up from the SDR range. So we're talking about the same kind of extension in each direction. And it's really important to note then that if you're doing a lot of viewing in a darkened room, that actually swinging toward, if we have a choice of whether we want to go up or down, knowing that we can't yet really do both optimally, unless you've got big bucks to spend, then going down the range in a darker room may be better by the right display technology for the room. So you might actually be better off with OLED if you're viewing in darker rooms, and you might be better off with something that's LED based if you're going to be putting it in a room that's harder to control the light in. So more ambient lighting. And then once we've got that dynamic range sorted, then you can imagine the video system has to paste the color over that. And the brightness level we're talking about combined with the color then gives us a shade of color. And think about somebody wearing a red shirt, and that red shirt under an office light and in normal ambient lit, like where you guys are actually standing right now.
Sure.
Ambient light there is probably somewhere between 80 and 100 nits ambient light. So it's you've got it bright enough, but it's not overly bright.
Mm-hmm. You're not looking into the lights with us.
Yeah, but if you guys are wearing bright red shirts right now, and then take note of the shade of red and how that looks, and if everybody that's watching this right now can just imagine what the shade of red would look like under office lighting, and then have that same shirt walk out into the sunshine, and the red now just pops.
Well, that we know for sure, because frequently we have worn red shirts, and they wind up looking brown red, not red in the videos.
Correct, yeah. And so that kind of comes down to, like you're saying, when you're taking it from the inside and the ambient light, the more between, like I said, between the what was it, 100 to 400 nits or so, and then you go outside, which of course is sunlight. We're talking, thousand nits, or more than that.
Thousands.
So thousands upon thousands.
In fact, it can be 20, 30,000 in direct sunlight. But the thing is, the color red of the shirt itself hasn't changed. It's still the same shirt, but it looks totally different outside. The color now pops. It looks a richer red. And that's what HDR aims to deliver, is if we take the same tone we had before and actually add a whole lot more brightness to it, then the color is going to pop a lot more and offer a greater tonal range. You'll notice more detail in it as well. So we need more. We need to expand the color gamut that we have to pick colors from, because we now want to push it into a brighter range than what was on offer before. And we now have display technologies that are capable of more accurately reproducing those colors than what older display technologies used to. Mm-hmm. But to be able to choose the right number of colors to get that tonal range that we need, because if we're taking SDR and we're already getting a bit of banding, we've got SDR is this really narrow little signal.
Right.
And we already have to use a technique called dithering, which is basically just applying lots of graduated dots within the bands to kind of smooth them out artificially. And that's why video processing is so important in displays, because it's kind of like fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
And it applies processing to make an 8-bit image look good. And that's even an SDR. Imagine actually taking that and now stretching it right out to high dynamic range. Whatever banding we had before is now being absolutely exaggerated to the point that it's unwatchable. So what we need to do is move on beyond 8-bit. And that's why 10-bit is the absolute minimum. And I mentioned before about the CTA's HDR10 format. The 10 is 10-bit. That's the minimum. Yeah.
Right.
So you have to have, and that's that term deep color, Brent, that you mentioned is talking about 10-bit.
That 10-bit deep color or 10-bit color at that point. So
now before you get past that, one of the things that we had talked with David about in our tutorial prior to our rebroadcast was the fact that deep color has existed for a long time, but they didn't do anything with it because without the dynamic range,
it didn't matter.
Deep color, you reduce some banding on the sky, but it really didn't bring out any more life to the video until they could add the dynamic range to the deep color.
Yeah. So and actually the banding is a kind of a good thing to talk about as well, because when you talk about banding, for us, of course, that comes down to we did an entire episode on the math behind the bits and how many pieces of information,
right, and how big the bandwidth gets.
How big the bandwidth gets for it. So of course you go from 8-bit, which helped me out again on the math with that.
16.7 million colors.
So, and then of course we jump up from there to 10-bit. Do you remember?
Which is 1.1 billion.
I think so. Does that sound right?
Oh yeah, when we extrapolate it out, it's about 1 billion. Yeah.
Okay, so hey, kudos to me.
Your math is okay on that.
Yeah.
So so with when it comes to HDR, I mean one of the main benefits that we get from it isn't so much that we have just a very bright screen, which in some cases you do, because it's you may have just a television or a projector that's capable of going at these super high brightness ratings, which is all well and good if you're in a very bright space or if you need to show off a very bright image of some kind. But that means, of course, that it gives you that ability to
smooth the picture out,
to smooth it all out. Yeah, so you can actually go. It's better to go down with
it.
That.
No longer looks like a paint by number painting.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Brent, what other misconceptions do we have
I
to
obviously
work off
was full of them.
Yes.
And we had discussed the difference between Dolby Vision
Yeah.
and HDR, which the goal is the same,
Yep.
or the goal post is the same, but slightly different in shape.
Well, and it's almost it's almost like the quality is a little bit different in what each one is looking for. It almost felt like to me that, and Dave, you can correct me on this. It almost felt like to me like HDR10 and even HDR10 Plus with the dynamic information. Which again, check out last week's episode where we did talk about. No, wait, the week before last, where we did talk about dynamic HDR on that as well.
And HLG.
And HLG. But it almost felt like the differences between the two were just to the point where HDR10 and HDR10 Plus were almost like let's just get something out there that works. And Dolby Vision is more like, let's get something out there that looks as good as it possibly can right now.
I've always, to me, Dolby Vision, and I think a lot of the more higher-end guys tend to treat Dolby Vision as a high-end audio video.
Sure.
The guys that move their speakers a 1/4 inch in each direction because it matters. Mm-hmm. Or audition speaker wires because it matters.
Yeah.
Where HDR10 was more of a one solution fits 99% of the people. Dolby Vision was, in my view, they went for how good can we really, really get it under the best conditions.
So,
David?
Yeah, I think of Dolby Vision as the bespoke, high-end express door-to-door service. It's kind of white glove, and it's about delivering everything optimally, whereas other formats are still subjected to some of the shortcomings that are inherent in pretty much every AV system, and that is we have devices that are actually making determinations and doing processing. I was just reading, because we're right at CES time now, that a new display that has processing that apparently is contextual, that actually looks at what's going on in the image and makes its own determinations about where the priorities in the image are. And I'm thinking, no, hang on, this is, the directors of the content determine that. They determine where the emphasis is, how things should look. So to have any of the devices that are intervening with that and actually making determinations about how a picture should look, and you end up with multiple, the source is doing it and the display is doing it, the end result is not necessarily going to be consistent with the content creator's intentions, and it's not necessarily going to be consistent with each other. They may be contradictory in some ways.
Oh.
So we're going to end up with things happening to the signal through from one end to the other. What Dolby Vision does is it actually has everything encoded. We'll package up. This is in standard mode. There's two different ways of transporting Dolby Vision. Standard mode, they actually essentially put it in a closed box inside the signal and have their own proprietary method of transporting it through without anything being messed around with it and displayed to its optimal visual appeal at the other end. It's how it's supposed to look. So, but then you need proprietary, the chips, the compatibility, Dolby Vision compliance and compatibility from end to end. So every hop in the chain needs to be compatible for the best type of Dolby Vision to work.
And this brings me up to my next favorite topic, tone mapping.
Ah, yes.
Now, it can be done either in the source or in the display. What is your preference for tone mapping and why? And give us a little background on what tone mapping is. I'm dumping it all in your lap.
So tone mapping is an interesting one with SDR. So with legacy video, again, when we say SDR, we mean anything pre-HDR. So with the old brightness range, we had technologies that were not really that capable. Didn't really need to do tone mapping because everything was working with a fixed level of brightness, which was not very much. Now we've got one display technology like OLED that might actually be capable of going to, say, 800 nits. We might have a LED TV that's capable of going to 2000 nits. But we might have a movie which is in HDR10, which has been mastered to 1200 nits. And there are different movies that are mastered to different levels. And so there's this mismatch between maximum capability of a display and whatever the format says it's capable of and whatever the movie itself was mastered to. And so what tone mapping is it's basically an algorithm and instructions that goes through with the metadata with the signal that says this is the curve on which you map it. The display knows what it's capable of, so it should do the tone mapping to optimize whatever the signal is. If you get a source to do tone mapping, it doesn't know what the maximum brightness of the TV is, so it doesn't know how to necessarily optimize colors to suit the maximum brightness capability. So it might not always get it right. So a little bit like, I'm not a big fan of scaling, video scaling, never have been. I've always been one for saying output native resolution and let the display do the scaling, because it's going to do scaling anyway.
Yep.
But let it do it, and it knows its own capabilities
That's one thing we have pushed since day one of HDMI. Just let it fly as native and let the display do the work.
So actually, that you've kind of touched on two misconceptions there, and the first one being that, well, if I want to have good HDR, I need a TV or a display that has a ginormous number of its nit value, of what it's capable of doing for brightness. And because of the tone mapping capabilities, that's not necessarily the case, especially if you're using something like Dolby Vision capable displays. They're going to map that correctly to make it look as good as it possibly can based on what that TV's capabilities are. So it's not necessarily that you have to have the highest brightness capable television or whatever.
No, OLED is a fine example. Yeah. Because it's not super bright, but it's super dark.
Yeah.
And most people, when giving walking by set to set to set to set, based on my experiences with the TV shootouts, most people would rather see better blacks than a brighter panel. When you walk in the store, that bright panel kind of gets, oh, look at that.
Right.
But then when you start looking at it, it kind of lacks that.
You realize that you're actually missing more of that contrast, right? Or that range of colors.
Which is hard to get in a retail environment.
So then, of course, and actually I've completely forgotten the second point of where I was going with that. But but that's okay. We'll move on. So some of the other misconceptions that I've seen, of course, on when it comes to HDR and whatever and whatever else. Now let's talk about color depth, and we'll talk about color gamut. when we look at like the standards for BT 709 and BT 2020, and now technically it's from what I've learned, BT 2100 is 2020, but with the HDR capabilities built in, it's all kind of locked into one. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
So now, do you have to have a BT 2020 color gamut? Is that right for BT 2020, or is that the depth?
Yeah, no, 2020 is the gamut.
Okay.
So that's the range of colors that the display or that the video system can choose from. So that's your palette of colors. And then bit depth is how many colors it actually chooses. So if you had BT 2020 with 8-bit color, then you're still only choosing 256 shades out of a huge gamut. It doesn't matter how big the gamut is, you're still only choosing not enough colors. But you get to choose 1,024 shades, or that billion colors overall, as Brent mentioned before, with 10-bit from a bigger gamut. So but keep in mind that
go ahead.
It is important to note though that BT 2020, because there's this other one that gets mentioned a lot, and that is P3 color.
Yeah.
And this is from Digital Cinema Initiatives, so this is not for consumer land. This is in commercial cinema. There was a time where they didn't need color standards in for a commercial cinema complex for each screen, because all the color management was done in the film, in the celluloid film itself. So it was handled by the studios, and all the cinema had to do was shine a light through it with the projector, and it's on the screen.
Yeah, very simple.
Now it's digital video, and the color management has to be done in the cinema itself. So they had to have a standard for it, and Digital Cinema Initiatives came up with a standard, and they call it P3.
So do we see P3 in the residential side of things, or even in the commercial side, very often, or if at all?
P3, it was never intended for the consumer side, but it often gets referenced because it's an in-between gamut. It's bigger than BT 709, and it's a triangle. The gamut itself, I don't have an image here in front of me, but it's the 3 points of the triangle are red, green, and blue.
Right.
And with a bigger gamut, it's actually just pushing into a more vibrant green, a more vibrant red, and usually a little bit of difference in the blue. And it just makes a bigger triangle, which just means there's more colors to choose from, a wider range. So P3 is bigger than the BT 709, which is the standard for HD TV, and 2020 is the standard for UHD.
Yep.
So 4K and 8K.
Think of your box of
P3
crayons.
is in between the two.
You got 4-banger, 8-banger, 64 different colors, and 128 different, the big box from Crayola.
Right, yeah.
And the thing with all of this is, you get that big a box, but what can you actually use? What can your TV use of that big box?
So I have this big box of 64 crayons, but of course my hands, I can only carry maybe 10 crayons at once, right?
Right.
And so I'm only going to be able to take with me those 10 crayons.
That's exactly it. And the bigger your hands,
the more
crayons you can carry, and the more colors.
There you
That's
go.
right. It is important to note also, though, that just because a display says that it can support BT 2020 color doesn't mean it can display all of BT 2020.
I don't
It just
think
means
any
it's
can yet, can
compatible
they?
with it, but it won't be able to go all the way right out to the edges of that container. It'll only do some of it, which is why a lot of the display manufacturers, when they're quoting their what percentage of color gamut they can do, it's kind of easier from a marketing point of view to say, hey, we can do 100% of P3 or 99% of P3 sounds a whole lot better than saying we can do 75% of 2020. But P3 is included within 2020. It's all inside it. BT 709 is all inside that again. So just because it says 2020 doesn't mean we're talking all of it. And I've only ever once experienced what's almost all of BT 2020 looks like. That was at Dolby Cinema at their headquarters in San Francisco. And they can do, from memory, it was like 96% of BT 2020. Which totally messed me up. I could never enjoy video again other than that. So
I remember
it was
Joel,
really good.
I remember Joel showing me a laptop that did pretty much all of P3.
Yeah.
And that was just simply amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really one of the misconceptions is that part of it sounds to me like the whole thing that we have to deal with when it comes to HDMI and bandwidth capabilities, where we'll say, well, I want 4K. Well, this is for 2.0, of course. I want 4K 60, 444, 12-bit. And
because
HDR.
somebody's told him AVS for him, or somebody told him,
And then, of course, at that point, it's like, well, you're not getting it because that's beyond 18 gigs. It almost sounds like that's kind of what's happening with the BT 2020, where everyone's like, I have to have BT 2020, and it doesn't sound like they're going to get BT 2020 to the maximum capabilities, because, like you said, you actually, one of the few people that's had a chance to actually see 96% or 98% of BT 2020. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about that, and it was magical. It was great, but that was also on a that was $1 million projector.
No.
So it was.
Well, that leaves you and I
only $1 million. Yeah, it was only $1 million.
Well, I mean, come on, Brent, you get paid that much per episode, so I mean, where's
you
your
found
projector?
out about my kickback.
I did, yes, of
See,
course.
now we're going to have to pay him. You told him, damn it. What is your thought on projection systems in HDR?
Yeah, can you get HDR with the projector, or do you have to have a TV?
You can. That's actually a really good question. Projection, yes, it's heading that way, and that. So
now, I'm
with
heading
CEDIA,
to old, but
yeah, for years now, CEDIA has teamed up with CTA with a working group called R10. Which is a residential systems committee working group to come up with some recommended practices for the industry. And there's one called CEB22, which is for audio systems, which is under review right now and about to be updated. It'll actually be published this year. And then we're about to open up one called another review of CEB23, which is video systems. The reason that really needs a review is because there's nothing about HDR in there currently, so we really need to update that. And projection is going to be a big focus of that, because projection has two massive challenges with dynamic range. One of them is dark, the other one's light.
Right.
So both ends of the dynamic range are a big challenge for projection. Ambient light in the room. Remember with projection that all you ever watch as a viewer in watching a projected image, you're only watching a reflection. Mm-hmm. And that reflection is going to reflect all light, regardless of whether it comes from the projector or whether it's coming from other sources. So if there's any ambient light in the room, and it reflects off the screen as well, then that's actually going to destroy your blacks. So your dynamic range going downwards is compromised. So lighting control in the room is going to be even more critical than ever to make sure that you can get your blacks. Display technology aside, I mean, the projector technology, you need to be able to modulate your blacks, turn individual pixels on or off completely, and have a really high-end lens so that you don't get light leakage from one pixel to the next to get really good blacks.
So
but
we're
the other
going
big challenge is
backwards in room design to where we were back in the old CRT days when there was no brightness on a projector. So we're going to have to get our rooms dark again.
Yeah. It really sounds like that. Like the room itself, the light control in that room is going to be of paramount importance if you want to have an HDR image on a projector then.
Yeah, in commercial cinemas that we're looking at HDR, like in the flagship demo cinema that Dolby have at their San Francisco headquarters that I mentioned before, even the exit signs in that room were a problem. But of course, there's requirements for those lit signs in commercial cinemas. But if even that amount of light in the room is a problem, then they've really got to monitor what they do here.
I wasn't. You're not really supposed to be going out right now, but I wore my mask and the whole social distancing thing. The wife and I had a date night finally. It's been since March that we had a chance. We went and saw a movie at the movie theater, and luckily the movie theater did a good job with everything. However, I'm sitting there watching the movie, and it completely took me out of the movie because every time I scanned over to the right-hand side of the image, I had the glow from the exit sign.
At the bottom right of the theater.
Yep, it was right there on the big screen. It was reflecting off of it. And you're right, when it comes to projectors, you are looking at the flat screen. The projector is usually behind you, and even if you have like a rear projection that's shining through the screen that you're looking at, you still have the refracted light that's coming through that. And so no matter what, you're looking at the reflected or the refracted light from that. And so the control in that space, I'm assuming now, is just it's going to be the biggest thing that to deal with.
Yeah, and the other end of the scale, what happens if you throw 3 times as much light on the screen?
Yeah, you get a lot of bloom happening at that point.
That's now lighting up the entire room, and of course, if there's anything reflective in the room, that's going to then reflect back onto the screen again, and that again is a compromise.
Positive
feedback loop.
Yeah, feedback loop happening at that point.
Does laser help resolve any of those issues for projectors?
It does. Laser is the high-end laser. When you go to full RGB laser, and the Dolby system that I mentioned is actually using 6 primaries, 6P laser, and
wow.
And they've actually got two full height racks full of lasers. I think there's 24 separate lasers
that must have one hell of a cooling system.
Yeah, but you also spend thousands on a lens that is that has no leakage from one pixel to the next.
Wow.
They can fully modulate the blacks, so black is true black. It's like OLED. It's like projected OLED, where you actually can't see, when they turn the lights off in that thing, you can't see the limits of the screen. You can't see the boundaries of it because it's true black.
And
I'm very jealous now.
Where is this at? You said it's at the
Dolby Vision, the Dolby Labs.
Yeah. This is at Dolby's headquarters in San Francisco.
So I think next time that we go to San Francisco, we need to make a visit, possibly try and set up a visit, right?
It's awesome. But the challenge when they were actually, and this is just a story that I heard, when they were wanting to measure the contrast ratio that they were achieving in there, because it's still not quite infinite like they tend to quote with OLED with absolute black, but they wanted to work out what the contrast range is going to be, and controlling the brightness was the really hard part, because of course you don't want reflections from the room going back onto the screen. And they weren't hitting the number they were hoping for until, and again, I was just told this story kind of secondhand, but there was a guy in the room that was part of a team that was wearing a white t-shirt, and everyone's just kind of looked at him and it's like, oh, you get out, and literally kicked him out of the room, and then they hit the number they wanted. Big room, and that one white t-shirt was enough to throw enough light back onto the screen that it actually messed up their calculations.
I mean,
So I worked on a theater where the side of the theater was a varnished columns with the fluted columns, and the screen was not a high gain screen. This was designed back in the 90s.
Sure.
And there was enough light reflecting off the screen onto the varnished fluted columns to shine back on the screen, and you saw these vertical lines,
bright lines
on the screen from the reflected. It's like, wow.
Well, absolutely.
For most people that are setting up a theater system for a client or whatnot,
cosmetics is a bigger issue.
Well, yeah, but if we see something like that, we're more looking for the shadow of something. So in my mind, in that aspect, I would be looking for a giant something in the dead center of the room that would be blocking the light in the middle, not necessarily looking for a reflection of some kind. That's really interesting. Yeah. So Dave, I remember what I was going to ask before, or one of the misconceptions that I've seen before is that this is while I was doing research. Someone had asked, well, should I have an Oppo Blu-ray player, which of course was may they rest in peace, but which is unfortunate. But they've got an Oppo Blu-ray player. They've got a movie that does the Dolby Vision HDR track on it. Track's the wrong word for it. HDR metadata on it. For that, and they've got a really high-end Sony display. And they, of course, Oppo was really great because it gives you the option of saying, well, should the media or should the Blu-ray player handle the that portion of
the tone mapping
for the tone mapping, or should the display? Now we've already kind of talked about that a little bit, but the Oppo is a fantastic player, and to their credit, to the person that was saying that. Contrary to what we've said so far, to their credit, the Oppo technically is the better device in that connection.
It's a higher quality device.
Higher quality. The Sony, while it's an amazing quality TV and display, technically the Oppo is what we would deem as a better quality. Should they still leave the control done by the display at that point?
I know what my answer is.
Yes.
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 Okay.
The reason is we're not just talking about old school, traditional video processing here, and which has the better video processor. It's about the tone mapping to give you accurate HDR to optimize the capabilities of a display and its maximum brightness capability and its maximum black too. So only the display knows that. So if quite often there's not necessarily a choice, but if there is a choice, then yeah, let the display do it.
I know one misconception that I and a lot of others had.
Okay.
In the early days, we thought the HDR data went down the video feeds. We did not understand it was metadata, and then that was processed at the television. We thought it actually increased bandwidth.
Well, actually, yeah, let's talk about that. So, Dave, when we talk about HDR metadata, one of the misconceptions, of course, and we've heard everyone say different things. Oh, it travels down hot plug. It travels down the TMDS. It travels down EDID. It travels down the DDC, which is EDID. Where is the HDR metadata, and does it change from one type of HDR to the next?
It is a very good question. Metadata is, unless we're talking HLG, every other format, metadata really is the lifeblood of HDR because it's the instruction sheet for tone mapping. Without that instruction sheet, then, of course, the display won't know what to do with it. And the way, when you have mastered content, to say a movie is mastered at 1,000 nits, then it's going down a certain number of stops from there. It's the whole idea is that the tone mapping says this has been mastered at 1,000. Now you count your number of stops of light down from that point. Without the tone mapping, it's probably then it may not know it's an HDR signal. It may not be complete. It needs to be able to set the maximum brightness level and count down. So if it actually doesn't have that correct information, it actually sets the bar too low, such as an SDR level, because it doesn't even know there's HDR there.
Right.
It's going to set it at 100 nits and start counting down from there. So your image is now going to be way too dark, and which is actually a pretty common fault.
Seen a lot of that.
So
yeah.
So the question then you had was, where is this metadata? We know how important it is, and the answer is it's actually in the header of the video frame itself. So with up to 18 gig, it's actually running within the TMDS line itself, and beyond 18 gig, it's going to be running in the FRL. So it's running with the video. It's actually packaged in the header of each video frame.
Like in the film.
It does not increase.
Yeah, like in film.
Yeah. Metadata has no impact on the bandwidth whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking it's going to be probably 1 or 2K of kilobytes of information at most. It's a tiny. It's like a little Word document in there. It has no impact.
Well, and that's precisely because it's in that, just like in our dynamic HDR episode where we were talking about that, to where it's literally it's in the data it's in the pixel data that's not actually on the screen. So when we look at like our display here, this is of course an 8K, which I'm not doing the math right now. It's got the 8,000 pixels here across the top, and it's got the 4,000. No.
It's 3980, I think, top to bottom, isn't it?
So you've got all the pixels here that are on the side.
3890, yeah.
Sure. When we get up to the top, it's not that it stops at that point. There's actually additional hidden data that the television, of course, isn't displaying because there's no pixels there for it. But all that information is running along that portion to it. And like Brent, like you were saying, if you were a projectionist back in the day when dinosaurs, but when you were
I do know where you were.
I know. But if you were looking back at that, actually really cool. If you go onto the Wikipedia page for HDR, the Wikipedia page for Dolby Audio, they have a really cool picture of a film, and it's one frame, but off to the side they show you where the audio tracks are, so that the system knows how to play the audio. You'll see there's multiple kinds of information on the side of it that's never shown on the screen.
If your TV allows you to do overscan, underscan adjustment, if you shrink the scan lines, you'll actually see the black and white.
Yeah. Well, and
which is
some
data.
TVs, even if you do the overscan and you shrink it down, some TVs will actually cut out that information so that you still won't see it because they don't, you'll be like, oh, well, there's something wrong with it. But it's still there. But all that information is part of that data, that metadata that's on the outside for it. Now, that's how, of course, the dynamic
That's
dynamic
my next
HDR,
question.
I was going to say, so when we talk about the change from HDR to static HDR data to or metadata to dynamic HDR metadata, the biggest change, of course, is that we're now going from saying, okay, I have this range of stops or nits or whatever I'm working with for the entire movie. So we talked about like the Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser. It's one of my favorite ones to talk about because it's set in the desert, except for the fact that the majority of that movie is set inside of the pyramid or the temple or whatever, where it's really dark.
Yep.
And so when you look at that movie, there's let's say a quarter of that movie where you're out in the bright sun. And so at that point, it may be too bright for that locked-in range that you have. So they may skew that down to the darker side whenever they're mastering it and getting it set up for that.
For HDR Plus.
Because the majority of the movie may be down in, for HDR 10.
Right.
For that, then of course they're going to master it for down in that. But then when they go outside, it's too bright. But when they're inside, it's good and they have the full range. But now with the dynamic metadata, you now have the capabilities as a producer or a director or engineer to now take that information and say, well, we're outside now in the bright sun. Let's go ahead and max out our nit values because, hey, we want to make, look, most of the information is now super bright. We need to get the information out there. And then now when they move inside, then they can say, okay, now we're going to move down to the darker side or somewhere in between if they're at like a campfire or something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, that is right. There's two key pieces of information with the metadata. One is the frame average light level or fall.
Okay.
And the other is the brightest pixel. And so it's going to be the maximum brightness anywhere, not just the frame average. So with static metadata, where it actually it's set and forget once for the entire movie, it goes for maximum frame average light level, max fall. So it'll actually take your frame average light level across the entire movie, or it could just be based on a particular scene in the movie and set the whole movie based on that. And the maximum brightness might be set based on what's the brightest pixel that appears in that entire movie. In one frame, it may be set on that. With dynamic metadata, where it's in the header of every single frame, and it can actually change frame by frame if it wants to, or set scene by scene. A lot of work to do it frame by frame, but it can be done. It doesn't need to be maximum frame average light level anymore, because it's now just talking about that one frame. So it's now just frame average light level. So so for every frame, it can say, this is the brightest pixel in the frame, and this is the average for the whole frame. And if it's a dark scene, as you say, then those values are going to be much lower, and it's going to optimize your darks. And so it's going to look better as it transitions from a bright scene to a dark scene. Or it can actually even be used for other purposes. Potentially in future, you get, if the Matrix was remade these days, and you've got that green hue whenever they're in the Matrix, that wouldn't necessarily need to be coded in, set in the movie. Basically dial the green up when they're going through post-production. That could be potentially something that could actually be set even in metadata in future if they want to. That's quite separate to HDR, but theoretically this is the sort of thing that metadata can do.
That's a really interesting concept, because at that point you're almost opening up the possibility for HDR movies to be released without having to go back through the post-production level of setup. And in fact, you're just going to the post-production during the HDR when you would be putting in the information for that.
And accurate tone mapping so that TV to TV to TV to TV, it actually looks the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is what SMPTE's been working a lot on now, is using metadata more and more, so that the director's intent, the creators, the content creators, their artistic intent can be properly represented by pushing it through with metadata, so a display can then know what to do. And this circles back to what I was saying at the beginning, how I've got an issue with some displays that are claiming to actually make these determinations on the fly about what's important on the scene. It's like they don't know. The display doesn't know. Only the content creator knows what emphasis they want their viewer to, who they want to be looking at on the display. And all of this can go in.
At which point my dad would turn the contrast and the green up anyway.
Yeah. So it's critical that we get the metadata through intact. That basically the easy thing there is just to make sure that you have high integrity in your HDMI connectivity. You need to have...
we know a little bit something about that, don't we, Brent?
Wow!
Absolutely. But you need to make sure that all the bits in between are going to be able to throughput the metadata, because as Joel Silver of ISF actually once said to me, the biggest problem with HDR is getting it to turn on.
Yeah.
And that is getting the metadata to the display is the challenging part, to make sure that it doesn't get whacked along the way. The other is, from a bandwidth point of view, we said that metadata doesn't consume any additional bandwidth. Neither does a wide color gamut. Going to BT 2020 takes no extra bandwidth whatsoever, because it's only a wider gamut of colors from which to choose. The bit depth, how many colors are chosen, that's the important part, and that does increase bandwidth. So all other things being equal, going from 8-bit to 10-bit is a 25% increase in bandwidth. Going from 8-bit to 12-bit is a 50% increase in bandwidth.
Right.
So there are complications and permutations, with 422, etc., and HDMI, which are complicated. I won't go into now, but generally speaking, we're most commonly dealing with 420 or 444 signals, in which case we're typically talking about a 25% increase, because 10 bits pretty much ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we do need bandwidth.
Well,
we are. I was just about to say. Yeah, we are at an hour. So.
And I know your morning's just started.
Yeah.
You've got a day ahead of you.
So.
Yes. Yeah.
Dave,
it's great here living in the future.
I was going to say.
What time is it there in the future?
It's now 9:20 a.m. So we're at time of recording here. So, and I'm getting quite comfy in your display here. It's a nice one. So I'm in the order of 16 hours ahead of you guys.
16 hours. Yep.
I'm East Coast Australia. Yeah.
So
now, real quick question, because we're special. Have you had a chance to play with any of the new 120 frame gaming consoles?
No.
I'm on a wait list. like so many people are.
We get a Series X, but we bought it on a street corner.
Yeah.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, cash.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's how we got our machine.
So Dave, this is probably a really good time to say it right now. Of course, Dave, you are with CEDIA, and so now's a really good time to go ahead and bring up the fact that most of the information that we've learned here at Metra about HDR, HDR10+, Dolby Vision, really just an entire wealth of knowledge for across the board when it comes to inside the AV world and beyond, actually. All that information we found, one through David here on just in chat when we chatted here before our meetings and whatnot, and then also through the white papers and the other collected information that CEDIA has available. So I'm actually going to go ahead. We're not sponsored by CEDIA for this episode or anything like that, but I am going to say that definitely take an opportunity. If you're not a CEDIA member, look into it. See about signing up to become a CEDIA member. I'm sure there's a bunch of benefits and stuff monetarily on that side. I have no idea what they are, but just the wealth of knowledge that becomes available to you through their library on their website. Just CEDIA, I believe it's CEDIA.org is the the starting point to get to it. You can look at signing up for that. Or is it
CEDIA.net?
.net. There it is. Thank you very much. CEDIA.net. Definitely go on there, look at logging into that information to get access to the information, sign up for that. It really was enlightening, to use a pun, I guess, and for what we're talking about. Pun intended, but it's honestly great, a wealth of information, and definitely recommend doing that. So we are at an hour for our recording today. We're actually a little under an hour right now. So I do want to say, of course, Dave, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the opportunity to talk with us about this and get all those other misconceptions out of the way. And I'm sure that there are lots more that anybody out in the field, if you're watching this, if you have other misconceptions or questions about HDR,
or need more explanations.
Yeah, you just need more explanation. Maybe it's not an HDR misconception. You just have a question about it. Are you doing it the right way? As Dave, as you were saying before, it's the quote, the hardest part about HDR is getting it to turn on. And the truth of the matter is that's absolutely right. It's one of the hardest things to make work, because as soon as it's on and running, man, it looks beautiful.
Yeah, manufacturers tend to hide the buttons.
Yeah, and you got to make sure that you've got all the correct equipment and everything along the way, which of course, give us a call. We can help out with that as well on our end. And then of course, if you have other questions for Dave, feel free to leave them down in the comments. You can also contact us here at Metra Home Theater Group at our tech support line at 386-492-8584. You should see that here at the bottom of your screen. As well as you can email me at adamr@metrohometheater.com, or you can email Brent
at brentm@metrohometheater.com.
And Dave, how can they find you? Are you on social media or anything like that, or what's a good?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and don't use a lot of others, but I'm Meyer at CEDIA.org. It is a little confusing that the email is .org, but the website's .net. But we won't go into that. Can I just quickly mention as well that just this month we've actually got the CEDIA CTA RP28, which is recommended practice for HDMI system designer verification, will be released. And that has got a lot in there about HDR and how to actually ensure delivery of HDR and bandwidth information. And it's a 2.5-year working group effort to put this together. It's been huge. So 68 pages of useful information, we hope. So that's coming out literally in a couple of weeks.
All the more reason to be a CEDIA member.
Exactly. So definitely now sounds like a great time to go ahead and sign up for it, get all that information. And everybody who's watching, again, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, or if you just have questions about anything that's related to AV or anything like that, if you want to find out why Brent's hair is white, you can ask that question in the comments as well.
I work with you.
Sure.
I used to be dark, young. My hair was dark.
Leave those questions and comments down in the comment section down below. We love to hear from you. A like, share, and subscribe is always helpful. Hit that little bell notification after you hit the subscribe button. That way you can go ahead and get notified about whenever we do go live, which normally is every Wednesday at 3 p.m.
But this week,
of course, we're not doing a live episode. But again, if you've stuck around this long, thank you so much.
I do have a question for Dave.
Yeah.
Dave, assuming there's an ISE this year, and that's a very large assumption, will you be doing training classes there? You just put the mouse right over him.
Virtually, and with the time zone difference, it may be pre-recorded, but it'll be virtual. I certainly, as an Aussie, I won't be allowed to travel where our borders are closed at the moment. So, but I think it's going to be there's certainly a hybrid approach, and CEDIA is taking every precaution and making every effort to make sure that we make it as accessible to everyone as possible. Even if you can't get there, you can still access it online.
Fantastic.
It will be good.
All right. Well,
in that case,
Dave, thank you so much for being a
joining
guest.
us.
Yeah, this has been great.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Really appreciate it.
I'm Brent.
I'm Adam.
We're out of here.
Yeah,
Have a great day. See you next week.
Reboot early.
Reboot often.
Don't cut your wires too short.
Call tech support.
Turn off CEC.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. We'll see y'all next time.